highlight of the week. And so this morning, we're well into our winter program now. We've got Rajith, who's prepared. I've gone to quite a bit of trouble to prepare some interesting images. Now, Rajith, I know, has been around a long time because I remember him as a student in Manchester. And it seems like more than 30 years ago, but I don't know. You must have been a very young lad then. Now Rajith's been very involved in Samatha. He knew Lance very well, and now he lives in Harrow, northwest London, and he's been running classes there for some time, as well as organising some retreats for Samatha people in Sri Lanka. So over to you, Rajith.
Thank you, Veronica. Well, before I speak, I'd just like to introduce a little prop that I'm just bringing and I'm just taking it off. So here is an example of a 5th century BC oil lamp, which represents the kind of light bulb they used to have at the time of the Buddha and in ancient Greece. And one of the really nice things about this kind of lamp is that it's carbon neutral, unlike modern day candles, which are using paraffin wax. Old-fashioned candles used to have beeswax in them. So I'm putting the lamp away now. Right, so I'm going to launch a PowerPoint presentation. Maybe you can see that.
Perfect.
So this is the title of the talk, The Expansion of Samatha. And let's go to the second slide and see what it's all about. So first of all, what do we mean by Samatha? And this is a very a kind of working definition. So it's a lay Buddhist educational movement that can provide a powerful experience for those who sit in a Samatha retreat based on the teachings described in the Visuddhi and Vimutti Magga derived from the teachings of the Buddha. That might sound a little bit long-winded, but for want of a better description, I mean, maybe you're sitting after the morning meeting in a Samatha meeting. I mean, you're sitting for a practice. So it's the practice that you do before the morning meeting and lunchtime. So before the lunchtime bell goes and that morning meeting, which has given you all the instructions, you're having a really good sit, and you probably might have some positive experience. Or maybe it could be the sit that you do before tea time and lunch. And some of these sits could be out in the open, maybe in the countryside, or somewhere quite interesting and exotic. I think that many of us have experienced what can happen when various mental factors are brought to bear on the object, which is the breath. And apart from the meditation experience, it's also something that does come from books and a tradition that sort of derives from historical sources. And it's very interesting that the Samatha technique is mentioned in the Visuddhi Magga that was probably composed about the 5th century in Sri Lanka. So next, 2 characters. America's biggest game show host, Guy Smiley, and the second biggest game show host, Pat Plajax. So Guy Smiley represents the ordained Sangha, or the Kruba Ajahns of Thailand. And the Kruba Ajahns are these very ancient masters who basically more or less enlightened, really, and anything that they say is law. So this includes people like from recent times, like Ajahn Mun and maybe Ajahn Chah, and various other Kruba, so-called Kruba Ajahn. So if the Kruba Ajahn say something, well, that's the law. And also there's also the Forest Sangha tradition that derives from Ajahn Chah that I've been quite closely bound with. Pat Plajax represents the Samatha organization. So Guy Smiley is America's biggest game show host. Pat Plajax is the second biggest game show host, and I understand from Keith Munnings that Samatha is the second biggest lay Theravada Buddhist organization in the UK. So I think that sometimes it's useful to consider what it means to be number two. And I think that number two is sometimes very, very significant and very important. So it's talking from the point of view of Pat Plajax, maybe. So the title of the talk is inspired from a book called The Expansion of England by I don't know, Professor J.R. Seeley, and it was given in 1881, 1882 at Cambridge. And so here's the passage from it. And it says, it is a favorite maxim of mine that history, while it should be scientific in its method, should pursue a practical object. That is, it should not merely gratify the reader's curiosity about the past, but modify his view of the present and his forecast of the future. Now, if this maxim be sound, the history of England ought to end with something that might be called a moral. I think that's a very famous Victorian adage about talking about morals. Some large conclusion ought to arise out of it. It ought to exhibit the general tendency of English affairs in such a way as to set us thinking about the future and divining the destiny which is reserved for us. The more so because the part played by our country in this world certainly does not grow less prominent as history advances. Some countries such as Holland and Sweden might pardonably regard their history as in a manner wound up. They were once great, but the conditions of their greatness have passed away, and they now hold secondary place. Their interest in their own past is therefore either sentimental or purely scientific. The only practical lesson for their history is a lesson of resignation. But England has grown steadily greater and greater, absolutely, at least if not always relatively. It is far greater now than it was in the 18th century. It was far greater in the 18th century than in the 17th century, far greater in the 17th century than in the 16th. The prodigious greatness to which it has attained makes the question of its future infinitely important and at the same time most anxious, because it is evident that the great colonial extension of our state exposes it to new dangers from which in its ancient insular insignificance it was free. So why do we talk about expansion? And I think it's a very interesting question because, I mean, organisms as a whole tend to expand. And I recently read a book called Becoming Wild by Carl Safina about culture in animals, and it's mainly dealing with sperm whales, South American macaws, and chimpanzees. And all these animals transmit a culture, to their offspring and to future generations so that they can maintain their line, and they actually educate their babies and children for long periods of time. I mean, this obviously includes animals like elephants as well. And Carl Safina's definition of culture is information and behavior that flows socially and can be learned, retained, and shared. And hopefully it is information that assists in eliminating disease or the elimination of suffering, which is how Buddhism has framed itself. Having said that, I think we have to be very cautious because there are many, many different cultures in the world, many different tribes, with different kinds of food and climate. And we can't necessarily say that one culture is superior to another culture. The important thing is that whatever culture is transmitted does help those who pursue it to maybe reduce the amount of suffering or level of ignorance that they feel that they have, or confusion maybe, or reduces the level of confusion. There's also another reason for expansion, which is the ways that like in the natural world things happen, which is the connection with a lineage that makes one a greater self. Because we all face deadlines in a literal sense, where, we're all going to die. So most animals will, if they want to kind of maintain themselves, they have to reproduce and carry something on. And as sort of individual human beings, we all like to attach to some kind of greater lineage that we make a connection to. And to make a kind of joke out of it, there's a little joke in this famous British comedy called Goodness Gracious Me, which says that Queen Victoria was the Empress of India, so she's Indian. And that's how we make links with various lineages, which have got absolutely nothing to do with ourselves. So we hear, for example, from Plutarch's Lives that Alexander the Great was descended from Neoptolemus, or some name like that, which was a mythical character who lived in very, very ancient times. And these sorts of ancestral connections are made with people who are totally fictional. I mean, this certainly applies to the Buddha, that, they kind of make a connection between the Buddha and a bunch of kings called Okaka, which starts off from this great king called Mahasamatha, who lived eons ago, that kind of thing. So here's the third slide. I'd like to talk about it in the context of the lay Buddhist and in terms of the culture of the lay Buddhist. I have a book in front of me, an unpublished book, I should say, by Venerable Shravasti Dhammik of Australia. And he has talked about lay Buddhism in his book, Footprints in the Dust. I think it's called Footprints in the Dust. I'm just checking it out. It's not really been published yet, so I shouldn't talk about it too much. Yeah, it's called Footprints in the Dust, and it's a kind of biography of the Buddha. And in this book, he says, and this is referred into the Buddha, he also wanted them to have a role in, talking about lay Buddhists, he also wanted them to have a role in building the lay community by spreading the Dhamma in later centuries. A sharp and baneful division emerged between the two communities, whereas monks came to be seen as solely preservers, teachers, and interpreters of the Dhamma, and lay people were relegated to the role of being providers of the monks' material needs. A situation that has persisted to the present. Such a division does not accord with the Buddha's vision and did not exist for the first generation of Buddhism. The Buddha encouraged his disciples, essentially, it's just changing it. The Buddha encouraged all his disciples to be well versed in the Dhamma so that they could help preserve it, teach it to others, and benefit from it. I will not pass away until the monks and nuns, the laymen and laywomen are learned and well trained, skilled and competent, erudite in the Dhamma, and walk the path of the Dhamma. Not until they, with confidence in the teachings, can pass on to others what they have gained from the teachers, explain it and establish it, expound it, analyze it, and make it clear. Not until they can use it to thoroughly refute false teachings that have appeared and proclaim the Dhamma in all its wonder. Tipitaka mentions a woman who would rise before dawn and chant some of the Buddha's discourses, and another woman who knew some discourses, although it is not clear whether she could recite them or knew them, having heard them in a sermon. The Buddha mentioned the hypothetical situation in which a monk might go to a layman's home to learn from him a discourse that he, the monk, did not know. This suggests that in at least some locales, there could be lay people who had committed to memory discourses that monks in the same area had not. According to the tradition, it was the servant woman Kujuttara who remembered and thus transmitted many of the sermons the Buddha gave in Kosambi. And then there are examples of several lay disciples, such as Chitta the householder. Now here's an example of modern day Buddhism, an expansion of modern day Buddhism, but in a paid format, in a commercial format, from the Financial Times. And it says that there are these apps, for example, there's San Francisco's Calm used deep breathing and quiet minds to become the first mental health startup to be worth $1 billion in 2019. The meditation app is soon expected to secure a fresh round of funding. And then there are these other apps. For example, there's Headspace, Buddhify, 10% Happier. These offer relaxation tools for the subscription of a few dollars a month. The second group are platforms such as Talkspace and Amwell. These connect users to therapists for a charge paid directly or by an insurer. So we can see that somewhere somebody's making lots and lots of money out of the mindfulness movement, which is definitely expanded. And who's going to start policing some of this, and who's going to start maybe becoming like an official provider of some of these fashionable trends. So just talking briefly about some lineages. So maybe I should stop sharing and just start showing some book covers first. So here is a book, maybe you can see, called The Chittahurst Story, written by George Sharp, about how Buddhism came to Britain from Thailand in the 1970s. It's a very interesting history book that I put in the Samatha library. I've also got something called Atlas of the British Empire by National Geographic. And here's an interesting book that I'm going to talk about a little bit. The Epochs of the Conqueror. And it's the Jinakala Mali Pakaranang, which was written by Ratanapanya Thera of Thailand in Chiang Mai and finished about 1518. So I'm going back to the PowerPoint now. So, you know, the lineages are very important. I mean, here there's another mention of a lineage, the lineage of the Iliad. The Iliad is just a nice ancient story that links to the Odyssey, that links to the Aeneid, which is the foundation root of the civilization of Rome, but it's a mythical foundation. So like all these refugees who were quitting Troy, started up all these foundational dynasties in Europe, including a kind of relationship with British history as well. And also there's the lineage of the Bodhisattva leading to the Buddha and the expansion of the Dhamma since then. And this lineage actually begins in this Jinakali Mali, long before the 28 Buddhas that we chant about. It's effectively buried in the very beginnings of, well, it's an infinite kind of history. So I think you can see this slide, but I'm actually going to start reading from a few passages from this book, the Jinakali Mala Pakaralang. Can't really say it properly exactly right now, but I'm just going to read. So there's a little passage saying, for therein the epoch of the conqueror means the time as far as the lineal succession of the dispensation commencing with the time of the aspiration of our teacher, the exalted one Gautama, and it is of diverse aspects. It should thus be understood in orderly sequence. Among the three aspirants to enlightenment classified in accordance with the period of fulfillment of the perfections as preponderant with wisdom, preponderant with faith, and preponderant with effort, our exalted one who attained enlightenment, having fulfilled the perfections for 4 incalculable world periods and 100,000 eons, beyond that, is known as the one preponderant with wisdom on account of the greater potency of his faculty of wisdom. And then it kind of goes on to the life of the Buddha, and it's some very, very colorful passages. If I can find it. Yeah, so this is about the life of the Buddha, and about, you know, he's going to Kapilavastu and stuff like that. And it says, on that very day, he performed the miracle of the double in order to dispel the conceit of the Sakyan rulers. Displaying his supernormal Buddha powers, he created an ambulatory stretching lengthwise to a distance covered by 10,000 world systems and 12 leagues in width, and made entirely of precious things, and pacing up and down in it, preached the Buddha Vangsa. And then he talks about the mother of Rahula too, who was looking out through the lion window which she had opened, beheld the Buddha's splendor, and sang his praises with the 8 Narasiha stanzas. The Narasiha stanzas are maybe some chants that we should include in our chanting book in the future. The Exalted One preached to the great King Suddhodana the discourse beginning with, "Let one arouse oneself and not be indolent." At the end of the recital of this stanza, the king established himself in the fruit of stream entry. And then it kind of talks about various miracles. He was performing the miracle of the double at the foot of the Gandhaba tree, created at eventide, the hour when long shadows are cast, an ambulatory in the sky, when the populace that had gathered there filled an area of 36 leagues, and its length covered a distance of one world system. The Exalted One performed a miracle there. Having performed the miracle, he lifted his left foot and placed it on the summit of the Ugandhara peak, and the other foot he lifted and placed on the summit of Mount Sineru. Thus, his three strides covered a distance of 68,000 leagues. Now, these are extremely mythical descriptions of the life of the Buddha, but they're actually found in many, many, many commentaries. And this particular book derives from various historical chronicles, such as the Dipavamsa and the Mahavamsa that were written in Sri Lanka. And they effectively kind of chart a kind of well-known set of myths and stories about the Buddha that many, many young children grow up with. So now you can see from the slide, I've mentioned the Chithurst story, and then I'm just kind of mentioning another little lineage called, which is basically these Western monks who were in Sri Lanka, Venerable Jnana Moli, who was a fantastic translator, and Venerable Jnana Veera, with whom he had a correspondence. And Venerable Jnana Veera, Veera's books have been made very, very popular recently, and he was worried about existential problems that were addressed in the teachings. And these sorts of Western monks led to the establishment of the Buddhist Publication Society that was started by Venerable Nyanaponika, who is a Jewish monk who lived in Sri Lanka from the 50s. And his teacher, or I think his teacher was Venerable, actually I can't remember, actually another German monk. And it's a very interesting story. And I think that we have our finger in, Samatha has its finger in this pie somewhat, in some of these Western monks who lived in Sri Lanka, and some of them have spawned monasteries that still carry on. For example, there's one that I visited in Slovenia, and that was named after the Danish monk who was one of the most senior, most Western monks in Sri Lanka until recently, and he died, and he was called, I think he was called Jnanadeepa. So that particular passage I read about the Buddha having his legs on two different mountains reminds me of this picture of Cecil Rhodes. And there you have it. And it's very interesting that the Jina Lanka Mali Pakaranang traces a history that extends to the infinities of time. And then it takes you to the life of the Buddha in India. And then it takes you to the history of Sri Lanka. And then it takes you to the history of Thailand. And then it goes through this kingdom of Lanna and another kingdom in Chiang Mai. And it ends around 1518 at Chiang Mai. And it actually talks about the transmission of a certain tradition of meditation from the Mahavira of Anuradhapura to Thailand. And that Mahavira tradition is the one that we practice, I think. So now I'm just talking a little bit about retreats in Sri Lanka. And here's a little video of the tooth relic. So that's a tooth relic procession in Sri Lanka. So I started these retreats in Sri Lanka around 2011, 2012. It was actually in the division between 2011 and 2012, and it was effectively a joint effort between myself and Venerable Metta Vihari, who is a Danish monk in Sri Lanka. And I think it's quite interesting about this kind of very deep history that has moved from like before the 28 Buddhas through Anuradhapura and then to the Lanna kingdom, maybe Ayutthaya in Thailand, and apparently Samatha comes from Ayutthaya. And now it's found its way to the UK in a willy-nilly way. And now we also have the opportunity of sharing some of the ways that we do Samatha in the UK with lay practitioners in Sri Lanka, which has now started. Venerable Metavihari and Lance Cousins. And the first retreat was in a place called Hantana, which is a hill in Kandy, and lots and lots of people came, including lots of Western monks. I mean, there was a Russian monk, the Japanese lady, and many, many other people. And I've only got mainly landscape pictures, actually. So this shows you the landscape of Hantana. And this shows you pictures from the first retreat. You can see all these cushions laid out. You can see the dining room, which doesn't look really that sophisticated, but all the tables were joined together, and a kind of bungalow that we were staying at. And this shows you something that Mr. Cousins wrote on the blackboard, which is a translation of the Anapanasati Sutta. So this is the stage, these are the stages of the Anapanasati Sutta, plus a little triangle at the bottom, which is the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And so you can see mindfulness of the body at the top, mindfulness of feeling at the bottom left, mindfulness of mind on the bottom right, and in the middle, mindfulness of dhammas or laws, which is why there's a L there. And it's quite interesting to see this particular pattern drawn as more like what you call a tetrahedron rather than a kind of square. And it's quite interesting that our practice has got 16 stages, and it sort of links with the Anapanasati Sutta as well. So these are some other images from Hantana, where we did our first retreats until about 2016. And it's a very, very beautiful place. And there's also a very, very friendly dog there who got close to us. And this is the last retreat that we did there in Hantana in 2015. And you know, in one of these pictures, there's Melissa and a few other people walking down the steps from a temple that we got a blessing, and that's Keith Munnings under the Bodhi tree. And this was the last retreat that we did at Hantana, and we were hoping to use this place again, but for all kinds of reasons we lost it. And maybe there's a chance to go there again in the future, who knows? But it was a very, very wonderful place to be. So then we had this crisis of not being able to find another place, and there was a certain monk, Venerable Vattikama Dhammavasa, who's the Sri Lankan monk you can see in this picture, and next to him is Venerable Jnana Tusita. And Venerable Jnana Tusita introduced us, or introduced me, to the possibility of this center. And after I chatted up with this monk who's got tremendous connections with Australia, he said, oh yeah, you can use my center, no charge. You're welcome to come and use this place anytime. And it's called Subhodarama in a place called Gampala. And so we decided to use that place, and we used it since 2016, which was when we had our first retreat there. And they got very good vegetarian food. And so these are some pictures of the Subhodarama retreat place at Gampala, and you can see Keith Munnings with one of the participants, and also one of the statues there, and a kind of purpose-built walking meditation ambulatory. Everybody gets their own personal kuti, and it's got this wonderful rainforest atmosphere there. And you can see a hill in this image, and this retreat center is on top of this hill. So we were doing these retreats until this terrorist bomb stopped us from carrying on. And this year also we've been blocked off by COVID, by the COVID pandemic. But it has been a struggle to actually get people to come to this retreat. And also the capacity of this retreat center is a bit small. Having said that, it's cheap and a really great place to do the practice. So I'm just going to go to the next slide. So these are some pictures of the retreats from Gampala. And I think that there are some advantages of using Sri Lanka for retreats. It's, you know, the proximity to India, Southeast Asia, and Australia, cheap and hospitable, and a growing body of connections. And I think that Sri Lanka has got this wonderful history. For example, it's got that things, I mean, it's got the connection with the British Empire, which is, I mean, in India, you've got Prinsep, who decoded the Brahmi alphabet. And then you've got Rhys Davids, who learned Pali in Sri Lanka and established the Pali Text Society. Later on, you've got the Buddhist Publication Society. And then you've got a rich legacy of Western monks. And some of them are carrying on traditions in Sri Lanka to this day. And there are fantastic, amazing places to visit for anybody who goes there. And since I became temporarily ordained in Sri Lanka, only as a Samanera, by the way, I've had these amazing experiences going to various monasteries and putting up in them, chasing after wildlife. So this is a place. On the left, you can see this rock inscription of a place, Kalugala. And Kalugala is a place where Lance Cousins spent some time studying meditation in Sri Lanka in the 1970s. He said that he understood something about medieval British society by living there, by the village, the village folk who go to that kind of place. And it's a place that I've been repeatedly visiting whenever I can. And I've even taken some foreigners there with me. I mean, some of the people who took part in some of the Samatha retreats. And it's an amazing place parked on top of a hill in a forest. And this is the kind of breakfast you get in the morning, which is kind of gruel and jaggery. And typically there's lots and lots of wildlife, including this snake. And here's a picture of Ian Rose sitting next to a waterfall in a place in Sri Lanka. And on the right, you can see somebody called David chatting with a monk. And David wrote a book called Walking the Tightrope that was published by the Buddhist Publication Society that led to my connection with Sri Lankan monasteries. So just to talk about expansion and empires. So this is something that there was this very famous speech that, or some writing or something that I think it was somebody called Ruskin. Ruskin wrote this big thing about the need for the British Empire to expand and to seize this opportunity. And that was in 1870. That was taken up by Benjamin Disraeli, who made a very famous speech called the Crystal Palace speech. But Benjamin Disraeli also said the greatest good you can do for another is not just to share your riches, but to reveal to him his own. And I think that whatever empire that people are interested in, I think it's got to be an empire based on values, sharing a good way of doing things, and improving our way at the same time. And then chanting, which was talked about in the last week's talk, and publications, access to books, libraries, periodicals. And I think that it's very nice that Samatha has been expanding publications. It's almost like having a publishing department or a print section, which is transmitting books. And like the Forest Sangha, Guy Smiley, in other words, has their own publication section, and they're constantly producing free publications. And we in Samatha are also doing publications now. So that's actually a way of transmitting the teachings to people who can't or don't want to, or for any other reason don't really meditate that much, or who need to have food for their meditation. I also think that the modern day empires or any kind of expansion movement have to take into account wildlife. I think we might be familiar with some of these recent horrific statistics that in the last 70 years, the wildlife of the world has declined, I don't know, by more than 50%. And if you take the weight of all the mammals in the world, about 96% of the weight of all the mammals in the world is taken up by human beings and our domestic animals, and only 4% of the weight of all the mammals in the world is taken up by wild animals. I mean, so like all these lions and tigers and things, they just amount to elephants. They just amount to like 4% of the weight of all kind of land mammals. And when it comes to birds, 70% of all the weight of all the birds in the world is taken up by chickens. And I feel really upset about this. I think that we have to really think about wildlife and think about creating space for wildlife, and any kind of empire or expansion has to take into account how we have been depriving the natural world. So yeah, so retreat centers, wildlife and meditation go hand in hand. I mean, most of the monasteries I go to in Sri Lanka have got tremendous amounts of forest still, which is a bit of a miracle actually. So I think there's opportunities to conserve and manage forest areas for wilderness and meditation. This sort of applies to Green Street as well. And in terms of expansion, we can't really carry on as an organization as just a single little unit. We don't really have enough resources, so we have to make connections with helpful people and organizations and movements, other movements that are that have got mutually shared values. So we have to have relationships with monks and monasteries wherever we can find them. So Vatikama Dhammavasa of Gampala has been very helpful in providing his center to us. And we've also got Venerable Dhammasami in Oxford, who has established a Buddhist university in Burma, which is linked to Oxford University. So I think these connections have a lot of promise. And here's just something to do with wildlife, something I filmed recently in the River Wye, just to show the importance of non-human beings. So non-human beings could include mythical beings like ghosts and gods, but it could also include things like trout. And so here's a rainbow trout engaging in an aggressive act. So I think I'll try and work out how to get to the next slide. So we have this famous British Empire map, which was kind of like the pink map. And I've got a few copies, original copies of the pink map. So right now, the map of Samatha looks vaguely similar to the map on the left, which shows you the United States and Britain and maybe Germany and also Sri Lanka, although you can't really see it very clearly that it's pink, and also Thailand. And I think that in the future, imminently, we've got Australia and India coming onto the cards. And hopefully in the future, maybe places like Russia, which is one of the biggest country in the world. And it's quite a secular country. And I think it's very, very open to Buddhist teachings. And it kind of represents most of Asia. It's quite interesting about how China has kind of closed off a bit recently. I mean, until the 1950s, if you read descriptions of Buddhism, they always said that Buddhism is the world's most widespread religion. And that's because they used to take China into account. But since the communist revolution, Buddhism, or the official map of Buddhism, has contracted dramatically because China isn't really on the map. But I mean, I've been to Russia, and I think it's very, 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 very educated people, and they're very open to it. I'm just getting rid of this telephone. I'm sorry. So next slide. So I just want to bring up this concept called the law of incremental separation. And it's a tendency for people to totally split apart after meeting, either by long distance illness or death. So, you know, like if you go to a country and you make some friends with somebody and you say, oh, yes, let's keep in touch. And you get onto the airplane and you come back to your own country. And that's a kind of a curtain that comes between you and that person that stops you from connecting up with that person. And basically you kind of drift apart, and it just turns out to be just a nice little thing that you said, but didn't really mean anything. And I think, but it's a very, very natural tendency that happens all the time, you know, that people meet up and then they split, and sometimes you can never meet them again afterwards. But I think that things like this kind of online kind of things like Zoom is making connections more possible. So even if we can't engage in air travel, suddenly there are these cheaper methods to link up with people, which will obviously assist with expansions of Dhamma teachings, although I don't think that it's a substitute for something more natural like using telephones. And so we come back to Pat Plejacks, the second biggest game show host of America. And I think it's quite important to understand that to be second is sometimes slightly more important and easier than being first. And well, you know, as an organization, Samatha is facing lots and lots of challenges, and who knows what the future will bring. So I think I'll stop sharing, and I'm ready for questions.
Rajith, you mentioned Venerable Dhammasami. and the Oxford Buddhist Vihara. He's actually associated with an insight centre here in Hungary now.
Oh gosh.
So I thought
okay,
we could add that to your
in
that way, you know.
I'm not really sure if I want to add Hungary onto the pink map yet.
Oh right. Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, well, yeah, another shade. Okay,
it's a country that's got a tremendous appetite, isn't it?
Yeah. There's a Buddhist university here.
Yeah.
In Budapest, yeah, where you can get.
Carry on from what Cos was saying, the Buddhist University in Hungary, I think it's called Dhamma Gate, and they've been involved with Venerable Dhammasami and Mahachulalongkorn University in Thailand with producing this common Buddhist text, which I edited. So it's very selected text from Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana.
Yes.
So, a fair dash of samatha in that.
I think it's quite nice to be able to keep the boundaries and the definitions of samatha slightly expanded.
Well, it depends what you mean by samatha. I mean, there's samatha as us, as an organization.
Yes.
There's samatha as a practice, samatha, shamatha, which is also found, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism.
Yes.
And then obviously there's the whole stream of Dhamma, including Vipassana and other traditions too.
Yes.
You mentioned a rock carving in Sri Lanka. Was that and I think a lance too. Was that rock carving one of the Ashokan ones? Did the rock edicts go to?
No. This is a Kalugala. This is a meditation center called Kalugala in Sri Lanka, and the rock carving is an imitation rock carving of other rock carvings that are like ancient rock carvings. So it's an imitation rock carving placed there by a wealthy founder of that place, but it's an imitation of ancient rock carvings that he created this rock carving about the principles behind that particular Buddhist center.
Wow, thank you.
Rajith, thank you for your inimitable and very unique talk, which was fascinating. Just a very sort of down-to-earth question about the retreats you were talking about, which make me want to go immediately.
Yes.
What time of the year do they take place? And also, is the tooth, the Buddha's tooth, what time of the year is that on display?
I can't really answer the question about the Buddha's tooth or the tooth relic, and that's in Kandy, so I can't really answer what time it's on display. But as for these retreats, we normally do them in the British summer months, so it's typically between June and September.
Thank you. And
we are planning some, and I also think one of the interesting things about samatha, because the Jinalanka Mali has got lots of stories about squabbles about statues and relics and the movements of relics between different countries, and I think it's very interesting that we have now got hold of a relic of the Buddha at our center at Green Street.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It was absolutely riveting. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have such a deep connection with Sri Lanka, and as a samatha practitioner here and now, we seem to draw on those two strands of Thailand, and we've been to Thailand, and there've been Thai monks that we've had teachings from and been associated with.
Yes.
And also there's a Sri Lankan temple in Wythenshawe, that we have connections, Venerable Panananda. And really what brought to mind was, what do you think's the difference? I mean, I think I know some differences, but what's your understanding of these two traditions and how what they offer samatha, uniquely themselves? I mean, maybe the Sri Lankan is more devotional, is it? And the Thai, I don't know really, they're very into meditation as well. But what do you think about that, those two different strands that have come into our movement?
Well, I'm going to first of all, I'm going to just expand the answer by saying that at the moment there are five Buddhist countries historically that practice Theravada Buddhism. So they are Thailand, Sri Lanka, Burma, Cambodia, and Laos. And unfortunately, Buddhism has struggled in places like Cambodia, and I don't know about Laos, but certainly Cambodia. But we have historically had one connection with Cambodia via Venerable. What was his name? That monk who came to mind. Chandavana, Venerable Chandavana, and I've actually studied one of his books. So it's just quite interesting that the traditions in these countries is they're very closely linked. And historically, there was a very strong relationship between Sri Lanka and Burma and Thailand. Certainly 500 years ago, there was an extremely strong connection. You can see this if you go to Burma, a tremendous connection between Burma and Sri Lanka in terms of clothing and things like that. But all of this was completely changed by European imperialism that effectively put blockages and also created disruptions in what was happening in these countries and the relationships between them. So I think that Thailand has got a very, very rich meditation tradition that they have maintained, but that meditation tradition has declined in Sri Lanka quite a lot. And the kind of Buddhism that has emerged in Sri Lanka recently that's influential in the West is a kind of intellectual kind of Buddhism, which is partly because of kind of English press and publications, and a kind of movement to a counter movement to a kind of missionary activity that was taking place in Sri Lanka. So I think that there are differences in historical roots in many, many ways because of the English language and the empire and various other things. I think that there's more connections, historical connections between Britain and Sri Lanka, recent historical connections. I think that Thailand is more exotic and it's got that royal presence about it. It's got that kind of royal thing. And maybe from Sri Lanka, yes, there's a rich tradition of chanting and history and modern recent connections. And from Thailand, I think that the meditation tradition is very, very well developed, and we have benefited tremendously from the meditation aspect in Thailand. And I think that it's the kind of something between writing something, intellectualizing something, transmitting something, which has been a strength of Sri Lanka, and a more of a meditation tradition and a kind of living teaching of a meditation tradition that comes from Thailand from recent times, which have both come together in Britain.
Right.
Hello, Rajith.
Hello.
Good morning. It's lovely. I really enjoyed it all. I just wanted to pick you up. You're just talking about the chanting in India. I just wanted to ask you a bit more about did you call it the
Narasiha Gata? Yeah, the Narasiha Gata.
What is that?
It's a set of verses which are describing the physical beauties of the Buddha, chanted by Yasodhara to her son Rahula. Oh. And each of the stanzas ends with "That's your father, the lion of a man," and I think that she was there was something about go and get your inheritance from your father, that kind of thing. Right. But it's a very interesting chant that Mr. Cousins has recommended should be incorporated into our chanting book. Okay. So I think that is probably about 8 verses, and it's quite a tuneful kind of chant that still survives.
Oh, right. Do children? I mean, I know you mentioned.
Yeah, they teach it in school. They teach it in schools.
They teach it in schools and
yes,
things.
Yes.
Oh, very nice.
Yes. Very good. And it's also, it's found in this really amazing. I mean, this book is effectively an official account of all the things that are taken most seriously by Southeast Asian Buddhists, and it's kind of embedding all of those little elements into this wonderful historical narrative. That's kind of from infinity to 1518.
Oh, right. Brilliant.
Amazing.
I was thinking, Rajith, this question about the different maybe emphases in Sri Lanka, Thailand, and possibly Burma. When we were in Bodh Gaya, I think it was 2006, and it was a big celebration, 2,550 years since I don't know whether it's the birth of the Buddha or the enlightenment of the Buddha or the passing of the Buddha. Anyway, it was a big celebration. And monks came from those three countries, and they spent every day chanting together, but in three groups by different countries. So that, what was it?
The Sri Lankans chanted the suttas, and the Burmese chanted the Vinaya, and the Burmese chanted the Abhidhamma, and the Thais chanted the Vinaya.
Yes, and it seems
all at the same time.
But I'm just, it was very interesting. How did they decide which group would chant what? Then maybe there is a sort of natural, it falls naturally to those three groups.
I do agree with you. I mean, Burma in recent times, Burma has taken a lead in Abhidhamma.
Yes.
They've got lots and lots of commentaries and sub-commentaries that came out from Burma recently. Did you say that Thailand chanted the Vinaya?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. That's very interesting.
And so Sri Lanka chanted the suttas.
Yes.
It was lovely to sit with the three groups, and each day you could just be there with it. It was very good.
We have ordered a copy of your book for the Manchester Library, by the way, Rajith.
Well, it's like a latest update to a bunch of historical chronicles that have been composed both in Sri Lanka and Thailand. But this particular chronicle wasn't really carried on beyond the 1518. But it kind of takes up to this wonderful transmission, and that's what I like, this kind of path. It feels a bit linear, but it's actually probably far more connected. But it's just very, very interesting about how it's talking about how the tradition got conveyed from ancient times to Anuradhapura, and then it went to Thailand, and then later on from Thailand it got returned to Sri Lanka as well at successive periods as well. So the modern monk lineage of Sri Lanka actually derives from various systems that existed in Thailand and Burma.
Right.
But that originally came from Sri Lanka as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
A colony and
no, Thailand was never the colony. Thailand was never the colony. Sri Lanka has effectively been a crown colony of Britain, or was a crown colony of Britain from 1815. Burma became a crown colony of Britain from 1885, roughly, until about the 1930s. Well, actually, in the 30s, they got... The problem with Burma was that Burma was amalgamated with India. So Burma was regarded as part of the Indian Empire until the 1930s.
Wow.
Then Burma was kind of split off a little bit. But Thailand, the Thai king was quite smart, and he used the French and the British against each other to maintain Thai independence.
Okay, because I've been I really enjoyed the book by the late Charles Allen, The Buddha and the Sahibs.
Oh yeah, I strongly recommend it. Absolutely, Charles Allen is a tremendous antidote to modern day people like William Dalrymple, who's writing very, very critical accounts of the recent past, and yes, it's quite interesting. Yeah, and the French, I think had a connection with Cambodia, and I don't know about Laos, but they certainly had a connection with Cambodia.
At a conference with Lance, and he had a long conversation with a Chinese Buddhist person. I don't know whether he was winding him up, but he was trying to persuade him. Lance was trying to persuade him that Queen Victoria was a lesser Chakravartin. A lesser universal emperor. Well, if you think about it,
yes.
The British Empire, if it hadn't been for the British Empire, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here in England or wherever talking about Buddhism.
See, the thing is that I think that talking about empire is very, very sensitive, very, very sensitive, and not always for the best of reasons. But I mean, if you look at, I think that the problem is that whether you like it or not, expansion by various powers is happening all the time. It's a kind of unstoppable thing, and there has to be a balance between something that we call an empire in the best sense of the word, and nation states. because nation states by themselves, which have become too insular, can sometimes they don't necessarily have everything that it takes to survive and sustain themselves and have the best from the rest of the world. So one of the reasons that caused Scotland to join Britain in 1707 was that Scotland was absolutely steeped in debt, and they were so steeped in debt that they decided to have an agreement of union with the British around about 1710, and that's how Scotland became part of the union. And what we're facing right now, because of COVID, is that so much of the world now is steeped in debt, and many countries, including China, are effectively waiting to take over now and start, canceling other countries' debts in exchange for territorial rights, which has already started. And I'm just saying that whether you like it or not, various expansions, I mean, I'm also talking about meditation apps, these things are always happening. And I think that it's useful to just think about how to guard your own little patch and share it with other people. The lovely thing about how the Buddha has taught the teaching is that he's always been asked to teach it. It doesn't come from, the Buddha doesn't say, I'm going to start teaching Buddhism to everybody. He actually decides, at least in the traditional account, not to teach the Dhamma until Mahabrahma or one of the Brahma Sahampati comes and invites him to teach the Dhamma, and then he proceeds. And I was once talking to Lance, and I was asking him, what's the point of doing all these retreats and stuff? I can't feel, it's very, very burdensome, and what's the point of it? And he was saying, well, if one person benefits from it, I think that that's good enough. And I think that that's a good answer. I think that there are one or two people who will benefit greatly, as well as sort of various non-human beings who I hope that non-human beings can benefit. I mean, thanks to one of these Samatha retreats, there was a little stray puppy that got a really good home and managed to end up in a big house in Colombo. So all I'm trying to say is that I think that if individual beings benefit in specific ways, that's a very good thing. And secondly, it's also a tremendous historical, I mean, where effectively, I mean, with the way that Mr. Cousins taught the first retreat in Sri Lanka, he was trying to make it specific to Sri Lanka. So he was giving teachings from the Visuddhimagga, and the Visuddhimagga actually includes the 4 stages of the breathing practice. It includes counting, following, touching, and settling. So we are actually relying on a very ancient historical method as well. And it's quite nice to continue that in some way.
Great, very good, very good.